The title of this talk is Human Evolution Has Been Dealt a Crippling Blow. This has been an amazing 2 years for the downfall of human evolution, and I want to go through that with you. Theory of evolution says that one animal, like an ape, changed into a human. And I want to ask you, from an evolutionist perspective, how does an ape change into humans? The evolutionists would say, well, it's by natural selection, it's by mutations, and it's by adaptation. And I want to go through those and show you that those three mechanisms for how evolution could occur, they don't work. And I want to show you that. So let's do first adaptation. Now, who here believes that adaptations that occur in response to what's going on in your environment, that those can be passed to the next generation? Adaptations can't be passed, and it's because of this principle of the body cells, which they call the somatic cells, and the reproductive cells. For example, if a person was exposed to the sun and gets a suntan and becomes dark-skinned, that's his body cells being changed. But when that person reproduces, his children are not born with darker skin. The adaptation occurred, but it can't be passed to the next generation because the difference between the reproductive cells and the body cells like the skin cells, they don't communicate with the reproductive cells. So there's no way to communicate to your reproductive cells that you now have dark skin. And Darwin didn't understand this. He actually believed adaptation, and he actually believed this is how evolution occurred. For example, Darwin believed that if a horse adapted to working out and get stronger and stronger muscles, that its offspring would be born with bigger muscles, and eventually that's how a different animal could form. But that's not true, because a weightlifter lifts weights, his biceps get bigger, yes. He's adapted to the weight, yes, but he doesn't have the capacity to pass that to the next generation because the body cells in the biceps cannot signal the DNA in the reproductive cells, which eventually the egg or the sperm is going to create the next generation. So there's no way that adaptation can cause evolution. Evolution scientists kind of know this, but they like to keep it foggy, so you kind of believe in adaptation, but it's a non-starter. It doesn't work. The next mechanism is the idea of natural selection. Natural selection is similar to artificial selection, like a dog breeder. He could take two dogs and breed them and just keep picking the smaller and smaller dogs and get to a small Chihuahua by artificially selecting. Same way with natural selection, you could get to a smaller or a larger animal. But both artificial selection and natural selection cannot introduce new body parts or new genes. All it does is eliminate genes. And like for the dogs, you could eliminate the tall genes, or you could eliminate the genes with brown hair and only end up with white dogs. But you're eliminating genes, you're not adding genes, and you need to add genes to create new body parts like a heart, a lung, a flippers. So those two methods do not work for the mechanism of evolution. And an honest evolutionist would say the only way evolution can occur is that there's mutations in the reproductive cells, and those mutations in the DNA would cause a new protein, and eventually the animal would become better and bigger and better, and eventually he'd get multiple new proteins, and then eventually a body part like an eye, a lung, a heart, whatever. But I want to show you this does not work. You got these 37 trillion cells, and then each cell has 3 billion letters of DNA in it. And that's both chimpanzee and humans have around 3 billion letters. So the chance of you evolving, you need to evolve a string of letters on the DNA code, and they have to be contiguous, like 300 letters in a row. It takes 300 letters in a row in the DNA to create a new protein. So what are the chances that you could mutate and get a new protein? And I'm going to do this for you in dramatic fashion and show you what it's like. First of all, you have to be exposed to something that would cause mutations. That could be the sunlight with the radiation from the sun. It could be a piece of uranium with the radiation coming from the uranium. You could get under an X-ray machine and be exposed to the radiation. You go down in your basement and get exposed to the radon radiation. But you have to have something that would cause mutations. Sometimes mutations occur just when you're copying the cell and there's a mistake. And so in order to create a new body part, we're going to wait now for a mutation. Wait for a mutation. I just had one right here on this arm cell. And but see, this doesn't do us any good because it's not passed to the next generation. It's a body cell. It's not. So we got to wait for, there's another mutation right here. I just had another mutation right here. But again, this is not going to help us for evolution because it has to be, the mutation has to be in the reproductive cell, in the men, the sperm, and the women, the ovum. Oh, there's another one. Now this mutation was right here, but see, that mutation does not, lead towards evolution because it can't be passed on to the next generation. I just had another one right here. I had a mutation right here. See, all these mutations are occurring in my 37 trillion body cells, 37 trillion body cells, and the chance of my mutate, I just got one, has to be in the reproductive cell. And I just got a mutation in my reproductive cell. But here's the problem. I just had to have all these mutations, finally got the mutation in the correct cell, the cell that will ultimately go toward my offspring, but it has to be in the right location. In my cell, there's 3 billion letters. In my reproductive cell, there's 3 billion letters of DNA. And what are the chances that that mutation in that one cell, that one mutation is in the correct location? Because these have to be next to each other, okay? And that mutation I just had in my reproductive cell, it was in the right cell, but it's in the wrong location, so I got to start over. And now I got another mutation. Here it is in the left ear. Does no good. Here's one here. Here's one here. Here's one here. No good. I had another mutation. This one's in my reproductive cell. Problem is that it's in the wrong location again. We got to go through another 37 trillion tries. We can calculate what are the odds of one mutation occurring in the correct cell and in the correct location on the DNA. Because every cell has this DNA, but you only want it to affect the DNA in the reproductive cells. And the formula is similar to throwing dice. So like if I ask, what is the chance of a dice, if I throw a dice, that it's going to end up as a 6? You would say it's 1 out of 6 because there's 6 sides to the dice. If I said, what is the chance that you could throw 2 dice and they'd both end up as 6s? Well, it's 1 out of 6 chance that it would be a 6 on one dice and 1 out of 6 chance on the second dice, and you multiply those to get the chance. And so it's 1 out of 36 chance of having 2 dice ending up as 6. What is the chance of 3 dice? It's 216. The next one, whatever, 1200. You get it. So you have to multiply the chances. So what is the chance of a mutation being in the right cell at the right location? And we're going to say that we're going to start this mutation list of 300 DNA letters at this certain location. Well, there's 37 trillion cells, so it's 1 out of 37 trillion chance of you mutating in the right cell. And then each cell has 3 billion times 1 out of 3 billion letters of DNA. So the chance of you getting in the right cell and the right location on the DNA, that number is astronomical. And that does you no good because 1 letter of DNA is worthless. We're trying to create a new body part like a heart or an eye where you need multiple large proteins. So that number then has to be multiplied for 2 letters. So what are the chances of 2 letters of DNA being mutated in the correct cell and the correct location on the DNA? Well, for the first one, it's 1 out of 37 trillion times 1 out of 3 billion. And the second one, it's that same number multiplied by itself, and you have to keep multiplying it to get to your protein. Those numbers are astronomical. They're so small because it's 1 out of billion, trillion, trillion, that the chances of this actually producing a new gene is essentially zero. The number is too astronomical. So how many letters of DNA do we need to change a ape into a human? And like an ape, like a chimpanzee. Well, for the last 50 years, since 1974, evolution scientists have told us that the difference in the DNA between a human and an ape or chimpanzee is about 1% difference. So that we would have to mutate 1% of the DNA of a chimp or chimp-like animal to evolve into a human. And that was the number that held the day for 50 years. In fact, it's still in the museums today. 1% difference between a chimp and a human, or 1.5. The problem with this number, 1%, is, number one, it's 1% of what? And it's 1% of 3 billion. So it's, for 1% difference in a chimp versus a human, is 30 million letters of DNA difference. Well, that's a lot of DNA difference between a chimp and a human. How many letters difference is there? We used to say 1%, but now there's a new article came out this year that said the difference between a chimp and a human is not 1%, but it's 15% difference. And this just came out in April, and this is, I consider it the death knell for the theory of human evolution. The difference between a chimp and a human is 15% difference in their DNA. Now, 15% of what? 15% of the 3 billion. Okay? So how many letters of DNA difference is there between a chimp and a human? 15% times 3 billion is 450 million letters of DNA. That number that we were calculating for getting one mutation was 1 over 37 trillion times 3 billion. That number now has to be multiplied on itself 490 million times. Chance of that happening is zero. And so when this article came out in April in Nature, where they actually, instead of just comparing a single protein between a chimp and a human, like the protein insulin or albumin, now they've looked and they've written out the DNA code for the entire chimp, for the entire human, end to end. They put a computer together to compare them, and they realize it's 450 million letters of DNA. This makes this whole process unbelievable, you know. And what I'm going to show you now is going to show you that all the evidences that they had been providing for human evolution is actually don't work either. But most people aren't aware of this information. I want to ask you next, how many ape-men that have been named in the past have been overturned since Darwin's time? I'm going to read you the list of ape-men. This is from my book. It's Appendix A of 9 categories of overturned ape-men. And I'm going to read you the species of ape-men that have been overturned. I've broken them into categories. So the first category is ape-men made out of non-primate animals like dogs and cats and raccoons and horses and donkeys. Here's the list of overturned ape-men: Tetrapothomo argentinus, Hesperopithecus harold cooki, Australopithecus prometheus, Orsi ape-man, and Flipperopithecus. And I'm going to read you another category of overturned ape-men, and these are ape-men made from recently buried humans. This would be like your grandma died 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and someone digs up her bones and says, oh my gosh, this isn't a human, this is a new ape-man. And this new ape-man is called, and this is what different evolution scientists have called these ape-men that were actually recently buried humans, Homo capensis, Diprothomo platensis, Homo pampeus, Homo cinnamento, Homo caputinculatus, Tetrapathomo argentinus, and Homo neogus. You see, there's so many ape-men that are being brought up, and then over time they get disproved, which makes this theory unreliable. The scientists unreliable, their claims unreliable, because if you wait long enough, they will be overturned. Here's another list of overturned ape-men. These are ape-men made out of apes that weren't ape-men. They were disproved. Pliopithecus antiquus, Dryopithecus platydon, Dryopithecus fontani, Oreopithecus bamboli. All of these over the years have been promoted as ape-men. Propleopithecus hecli, Proconsul africanus, Ramapithecus punjabicus, Brahmapithecus punjabicus, and the like. So those were ape-men that turned out to be just apes. And so, not to belabor this, but I wanted to read you this list, and the number in this appendix here is 237 ape-men have been overturned. It's pages and pages of ape-men. If you don't have a mechanism for evolution, and if all these ape-men that they keep bringing up just get overturned after 50 or 70 years, this doesn't seem like this is counteracting the problem with the DNA. We really don't have a lot of belief in the evolution scientists that they could make so many false ape-men. How many ape-men currently on display in the natural history museums involve fraud? If I ask that to a evolution group, they would say 0. There's no fraud in the museums today. And I would say there's a lot of fraud in the museums, and I want to show it to you. These are ape-men that you go to any museum, you'll see, a model of these, and they're fraud. For example, if you go to the Smithsonian today, there is this ape-man called Tumai. It's also called Sahelanthropus tashidensis. And it's supposed to be 6 million years old because they dated the rock. It's supposed to be an upright walking because the spinal cord comes in the center like a human, not in the back. And it was the biggest ape-man in 2002. It was probably the biggest ape-man of this century. And it was on the front cover of Nature and Time. And we interviewed the evolution scientist who discovered it. And he made 4 frauds. Even though this thing is in the museums, all the points that would make it an ape-man are fraudulent. So he said in our interview, and he's also in his writings, that this Tumai skull was found by itself. There was no other bones of the skeleton. And yet, his colleague who got in a fight with him provided me this picture of the Tumai skull and all the bones that were found, and this is how they found them. This isn't an assembly. The bones just lay on the top of the sand here, and they found this bunch of bones. It's artiodactyls and this, and then this primate skull. And he said there's no other bones besides the skull that was found, and yet look at here. Here is a hominoid femur. A hominoid means an ape femur. Now, why would he not want to bring that to everybody's attention? Because that's like good, another proof that he found an ape-man. And why did he hide the fact from his colleagues that there was a femur? That's a good question. This came out in Nature that he hid the fossil for 17 years from his colleagues. He actually was having it broken and to be tested for dating for another reason, and someone realized this is an important fossil, and they said, no, we can't tear this bone apart. Well, here's the reason he was not excited for the world, including the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian does not have this leg bone on display. Here's why. Here's the leg bone that I just showed you in 4 different views, and here is the a femur of a modern chimpanzee. If it's an ape man, it shouldn't look like a modern chimpanzee. It should look like something part human, part ape. But when you lay those bones right on top of the modern chimp femur, they're a match. So in other words, he found a chimpanzee-like femur, and he fraudulently kept it a secret from his colleagues, from the museums, et cetera, et cetera. The second fraud, he said, hey, look, my tumai has a hole in the bottom of the skull, the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord comes through, that's not in the back of the skull like a gorilla or an ape living today. And it's not in the middle like a human, but it's halfway between those two, scooted up in an ape-man position, just like I thought. Well, this also was fraud because, number one, the skull did not look like this. And number two, the original skull and this CAT scan reconstruction, he won't let anybody see. That's very odd. Why wouldn't you let your colleagues see the fossils, see these CAT scans, see how you reconstructed it? And the reason is that he moved this foramen magnum down here to up here. And I'm going to show you how he did it. This is what the original skull looked like. It's all distorted. See how the teeth have right and left arcades? The right arcade's right in the middle of the bottom of the skull. So this whole thing is twisted, it's gnarly. The foramen magnum is all distorted. And this is what he was presented with. And he had to make a choice when he reconstructed it. There's this bone of the occiput, and he could either bring this end down. I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing here. He could bring this end down, and it would be in the ape position, and then it would just be an ape. Or he could bring this end up in his reconstruction, and he could move it closer to the human position. And he did that. He didn't show anybody how he did it. He just said, oh, it had this position. And look, it's in the perfect ape-man position, but that is also fraud, especially since you won't let others see the fossils. Third, he said the fossil was 6 million years old. How does he know it's 6 million years old? He wrote in Nature and different magazines that when he dug up the skull, it was embedded in rock. He took the rock and dated the rock. That's kind of common for them to do that. And so it was important for him to say that he dug it out of the rock. But his colleague, who he got in a fight with, Alan Bouvillain, gave me the lowdown on this, is that this skull, which is tumai, and Dr. Bouvillain took this picture, this was 1 hour or 2 hours after its discovery. It was laying on this sand, and here's the imprint of it. This skull was laying right here. They sat it up for the picture, and it wasn't found in rock. There was no way for him to date the fossil. So he didn't really know how old it was. He really didn't know where the foramen magnum was. He really hid the fossil. That's just one of, I'm going to do 5 or 6 of these frauds. I think that's how many are in the museums today. But here's the next one. Homo habilis. It's in every museum. And this was found by Dr. Philip Tobias at the University of Witwatersrand. And he committed 3 frauds. The first fraud was on the type specimen of Homo habilis. That's the first skull he found. And what he's trying to do here is he's trying to make a large brain ape man because, you know, chimps and apes, their brains are around 450 cc's and humans is around 1,300 cc's. And he wants to bridge the gap between the 450 and the 1,300 and come up with an ape man with a brain of around 600 to 700. That was his goal. And really what he's finding is Australopithecus fossil skulls, and he's enlarging them to make them into an ape man. So here's how he did this. So here's the type specimen. Here's what he published, the photograph, and there's probably nothing wrong you could see there, but if you actually photograph the real fossil, you'll notice that part B is all plaster, and he added plaster to the skull to enlarge it. And part A is also added. It wasn't part of this skull. When you flip this over and look at part A, on his photograph, which has been doctored with Photoshop right here, see that it's dark, but it's really white plaster filled in here. You can't really see that this is a different color skull piece and that it's connected with a white straight line, I mean, a straight line, that it was a skull piece from another skull that he put on here to make it a larger skull, to make his ape-man. Here's the other part of that skull, and same thing on part C. You can tell, you can't tell on his picture, but you can tell on the real photograph that this is two different skulls. And again, it's not a puzzle-like fit, but just a straight line. And he admitted it later that this skull was assembled from other fossils, which you normally don't do with a type specimen. The next fraud he did with Homo habilis was this skull STW53. He found these 13 or 14 pieces, and he had his colleague assemble them into this skull. And this is called Homo habilis, and another Homo habilis skull. And his colleague made this full skull here. It's three different views: side view, bottom view, and front view, but these are all the same. And when the scientist finished with it, he brought it back to him, and he said, "That's too small. You need to make it bigger." And he said, "Well, it is what it is. Your Homo habilis has a small brain like an ape." And he says, "Make it bigger." He refused. Eventually, he got his colleague to increase it by taking all the bones apart and adding more plaster. And you can see before and after that he was able to enlarge this by about 250 cc's before and after. And that was his second fraud. And that's still on display at museums today. And here's a third fraud with Homo habilis. This is a skull OH16, and it just looks like a skull, but he reconstructed it with extra plaster to spread out the bones. And you can see the bones touch here, but they're all spread out here, and he enlarged that too. So that's the second ape-man that's on display right now that's fraud-based. The third one is Homo erectus, which is supposed to be, and this is a Turkana, supposed to be a human body, but a head that is ape. In other words, the face sticks out in front of the brain case. Here's the brain case line where the brain case ends here, and the face sticks out like an ape. But this is also a fraudulent fossil, and it's currently on display, and they have a plaster copy of this. It's not, you couldn't see this on the museum copies. So here's the first thing is his published photograph of the fossil, which all the scientists saw, looks different than the actual fossil. Somehow these two should be the exact same, but they don't. How could this fossil change? And what he did was he photoshopped some of the filler material where the bones were missing to draw your eyes there, but he didn't change the filler where he wanted to not be noticed. See, there's filler here, but he leaves that filler black, but this filler, he changes it in Photoshop to white, so your eyes are drawn here. You think it's a pretty good skull. When you look up even closer, you'll realize that he had the capacity to move the skull, because this he disassembled right here and put a spacer in there. He's able to pull this face outward. He put spacer here and spacer here and pulled this face out on Homo erectus, which normally would be considered Homo sapiens. And when I contacted him, he admitted to me, first of all, he couldn't explain why it was photoshopped. Number two, he admitted to me that this face was in the wrong position. He said it should go back. Okay, very good. I don't know what animal we're on. The fourth current display, you can go into any museum and see this one. It's Homo rudolfensis 1470, and it's supposed to be an ape-man with a small ape-sized brain. It's really an Australopithecine probably, but it has a flat human face. See, and so it's like an ape-man. It has ape-sized skull, flat human face, ape-man. The problem is that this is not what the fossil looks like. If you go see the original fossil, which Debbie and I photographed here, you'll notice that this face is not attached, except for right here, and that's really a false attachment. It has metal structure holding it. If you flip this thing over, see there's a cage here that holds the face on. And if you look and do real close photographs, you can see that this Homo erectus skull doesn't match up. What he did was he put the face into the flat position, pulling it down. And in order to do that, he made all the bone pieces offset. This is not a natural setting. These are all offsets. And he was told at the time it should probably go out like an Australopithecine. He knew it, and yet this is the way they promoted it. This is the way the museums have it. And museums don't tell you that this face is artificially placed. So the next one that's on display in museums today that's current and that is fraud is Lucy. And here is what they make Lucy look like at any museum, the Lucy skeleton. But this is not what the Lucy skeleton looks like. It's artificial. It's fraudulent. This is what the skeleton looks like if you lay it out on the ground. And you'll notice that this pelvis bone is flat like an ape. And in apes, the pelvis bone doesn't come forward. It just stays on the back plane of the body. Whereas in humans, it comes forward. In humans, it comes forward like this. In fact, you can feel your pelvis bone under your belt in front, okay? So they found the fossil and it looked flat like an ape, but they display it as human, as a 3.5 foot tall human with a human pelvis. Here's the same pelvis here, but now it's stood up and we're looking at it the side view at Dr. Johansson's office. You can see this thing is flat like an ape pelvis. It doesn't turn forward. And yet in the displays at the museums, they put a artificial pelvis in here that has been altered, and that is fraud. He also, Dr. Johansson for Lucy said, and the museum say it had a human knee joint, and that is not true. I could, if we had more time, I could show you that. But his partner told us that the knee joint of Lucy wasn't human-like, but it was ape-like. And another fraud was Dr. Johansson said that Lucy made these, a Lucy species made these fossil footprints because at this spot called Laetoli, Tanzania, there's these human footprints, and Dr. Johansson said the only animal that could have made these is the Lucicine afarensis, because that's the only ape or, anthropoid that was found there, which was another lie. This human skull was found at Laetoli, it's fossil LH18. So those were frauds in the museums currently. This is not going well for evolutionists. Now, my next question to you is, how many frauds have been perpetrated by human evolution scientists over the years? Not the ones only in the museums, which I just showed you, but all of them, going back to 1859. How many frauds can you think of? And again, if this was a evolution science crowd, I think most people would say one. We know about one because the Piltdown man was a fraud, and we all know about that. And it might surprise them, and it might surprise you, I don't know, but we reviewed this and counted them up, and the number of frauds that have been perpetrated since Darwin's time by human evolution scientists, and fraud, I mean, the scientist knew he was misleading his colleagues by altering the photos, altering the fossils, altering the diagrams, or hiding information. It's happened 150 times, 150 frauds. Again, going along with the DNA piece of this thing is like, this thing is starting to look like, really tacky science. So I'm going to show you some of these other frauds that aren't in the museums today because they've already been eliminated and disproved. The first one is this F. Clark Howell, who we interviewed, who made up this chart that everybody's familiar with. He knew that 10 of these animals in this chart were not ape-men, but he put them in his chart anyway. Now that's pitiful. And you can see that very well documented in book 4. and all the quotes that you can know this. And besides his frauds of those 10, he wasn't aware of his colleagues had committed 3 other frauds that made up these. So 13 of the 14 animals in this chart were frauds. And the 14th, which is Ramapithecus, turned out to be not fraud, but it's not an ape-man either. It has to be removed. So there's 13 frauds right there out of these 150. Another ape-man was this one, the Nebraska ape-man. And if evolutionist was in the audience, oh, why are you bringing it up? The creationists always bring it up. I'm bringing it up because you don't know it, and it's just recently been shown is that the Nebraska ape-man was not a mistake of a pig tooth interpreted as this ape-man, but it was a fraud, a series of frauds. And what is my evidence for that? Well, when this thing came out, it was on the full pages in the New York Times, full pages in the Illustrated London News. It was called the Ape-Man of the Western World, Nebraska man or Hesperopithecus. But when they announced it, they said it was found in 1921, the year before, and they're just announcing it. But that was a fraudulent statement because it had been sitting around for 4 years, 4 or 5 years on the shelf, and nobody paid attention to it because it was just another pig tooth. And they also knew since 1908 that the pig teeth that they were finding at this site looked like human teeth. But they never told anybody about that when they announced the ape-man. That's kind of an important piece of information, that the pig teeth at this site where you found an ape-man look like humans. Here's another fraud. This was a Piltdown man. This was 5 frauds, and most people are aware of the one fraud of planting this, but most people don't know that there was 5 frauds. Most people don't know who was the perpetrator. And the perpetrator was one of the museum scientists. And this got proved in, I think, 1980s. This was the human skull and orangutan jaw that was broken into multiple pieces and planted at 2 dig sites. Most people aren't aware of that, with artifacts such as a digging bone made out of elephant bone and beaver teeth and things like that to make it look old. But when it was announced in 1912, it reached all this press, and it turns out in 1996 they identified who committed the fraud, and it was Dr. Martin Hinton, who turned out to be later the curator at the Natural History Museum in London. Their own scientists planted this thing for whatever reason, and wow, yeah. Here's another fraud that people aren't aware is a fraud. This is how we get started with this wrong idea that the Neanderthal man was a bent over ape-like looking creature. It had bent knees like an ape, bent hips like an ape, used archaic tools, and it was hair covered. This came from 1906, 1909 from the Natural History Museum in Paris. But he committed 4 frauds to carry this out. Number 1, here's a human skull bottom and a chimp. You can see the chimp's foramen magnum's in the back, the human's in the middle. And this Neanderthal, he said the foramen magnum was halfway between a human and ape, but he moved the foramen magnum forward. And this is how he did it. And this just came out in the 1980s, that what looks like solid bone here isn't, it's filler. And this is where the filler is. It allows you to move bones, these bones here, you can move this thing forward or backwards, depending on how you want to do it. So he moved the foramen magnum. Number 2, he said that the chimps have their neck bones go straight back. Neanderthals go straight back, but humans, their neck bones go down. But 40 years later, this Dr. Arenberg, who succeeded him, got some human bones and took a picture of them and drew a drawing, and this is what the humans. So he altered the human neck bone drawing to make a fraud, and then he claimed that the Neanderthal leg bone, which is bent back, proved that it couldn't straighten his knee like an ape, can't straighten his knee, but he knew that humans sometimes have this same bone. Here's a modern human bone and here's Neanderthal. And yet he didn't share that, and he perpetrated that falsehood. How many ape-man fossils are kept off limits, are hidden from their colleagues? See, this would suggest if fossils are kept off limits and their colleagues can't inspect them, that they're probably not very good fossils. Why wouldn't you want your colleagues to see? Why you'd want everybody to see it. But if you knew in the back of your mind that this wasn't an ape man, but it's just an ape or just a human, you would be reticent to share, let others to see those fossils. So how many times has this gone on where the scientists have hid the fossils for years, decades? Here's the list. Dr. Du Bois hid his Pithecanthropus under the floorboards of his kitchen and later in a safe for 24 years, all the while he was going around promoting this as an ape man. It turned out to be just Homo erectus, which turned out to be Homo sapiens. Dr. Boole, who moved the Foramen Magnum, he hid his fossils his entire life. He would not allow other scientists to see the Neanderthal skeleton that he had found. Even though the scientists would come to the museum from America multiple times, he kept turning them away, wouldn't allow them to see it. Piltdown Man, the reason it went on for 40 years from 1912 to 1952 is because the museum would not allow scientists to inspect the original fossils, which is crazy. You know, even like Leakey couldn't examine the Piltdown fossils. And so how could you hold him responsible for missing it? Because they wouldn't let him see the originals. Toomai, Dr. Brunet, we already talked about, he won't let his colleagues see the original fossils or have pictures, the CAT scans or have copies of the CAT scan, the copies of the recreated skulls. He keeps it all hidden so much, he doesn't even share a copy of the skull with the museum. The museum copies are just made up by somebody that never really had the original. Dr. Berger denied us interview and of seeing his fossils after he found out that we were going to interview his colleague who disagreed with him. Neanderthal fossils in Brussels, they promised us they would share those with us, and they would not, despite 6 attempts. The Neanderthal fossils in London, they would not share with us, despite multiple attempts. Lucy is still off limits. I've been trying for 25 years to get in to see the original Lucy, as well as evolution scientists like Dr. Sussman in 1983, I think it was 83 or 92, went over there to Ethiopia and was denied access to the fossils. Ardipithecus, you can't see because it said Ethiopia. Orion, he would not allow us access. And the Trichonoboi, even though we got to photograph it, they wouldn't let you photograph it with the jaw attached, which would have given away that the face was in the wrong position. So I want to close this up with ask you this question: how many of the accepted ape-man skeletons are just fragments? In other words, we're at about 160 years since the theory has been around. We've collected hundreds of primate skeletons. We should be able to see an ape-man farm from an ape going to a human in full skeletal, collection, so to speak, not just having a few bones or a skull bone or something and say, oh yeah, there's evolution, you just can't see it, but imagine that that's what he is, ape man. See, the more fragmented they are, the less reliable they would be in making a decision if evolution is true or not. Well, here's the best copy of Homo habilis. It's the best skeleton we have, and you could make that into any animal you wanted. Ape, monkey, ape man, because it's just too fragmented. This is the best they have of this, despite looking for 150 years. Here's Orion. It's just a few leg bones and a couple teeth, and yet they have made up a whole story about them. That is not sufficient to judge evolution. Here's Ardipithecus. They talk about him a lot, but you'll notice in color here is where the actual bones are. They have so little of the skeleton, and you could make up any story about mobilization. Even Lucy, supposed to be so well complete, there are numerous problems identifying exactly what her tibia look like, what her feet look like, what her hands look like, what her different vertebrae look like. And you could tell many different stories, and different scientists tell different stories about the Lucy skeleton. And there's other fragmentary incomplete fossils like Africanus, Anamensis, Robustus, and many, many more. So, in summary, and what we did tonight is that humans and apes differ by a tremendous amount in their DNA. 490 million letters of DNA. That's new news. It just came out this year in 2025. And the chances of altering one letter is 1 out of 37 billion times 3 billion. And so it's impossible for evolution of humans to occur from an ape based on that information. The next piece that we covered is that the ape-men that are brought forth every year they announce another one, are unreliable because every year one goes and gets disproved. And there's been 237 overturned ape-men. I started to read you the list. I probably only read 15 names, but that list had 237 names on it. That's not very, very scientific and very reliable. We also talked that the museum displays are unreliable. There's multiple frauds in museums at every museum today. American Museum, Smithsonian, all over the world. I've been to many of them. They have those 5 or 6 that are frauds. Human evolution scientists, besides those frauds that are in museums today, have committed a total of 150 frauds, like the March to Man one, small ape going to the big one. He knew that was all fraudulent. Like Lucy was fraud, like Toomai was fraud. And surprisingly, fossils are inaccessible, fossils that they're talking about. And this has been a recurrent problem. They promote fossils, but make them inaccessible to scientists who would want to criticize them. And that way they can keep the fossil ape-man story going until they can retire. So after 150 years, we have very little in the fossil collection. It's just fragmentary bones, and it's not very convincing. All this information, you can watch it in our DVD series. It's 8 episodes. They're all shot on location all over the world. And if you don't have a DVD player, you can stream these 8 episodes, and you can get to that through the website. I put my website address on the top of the chat. And these are really spectacular videos. In fact, episodes 5 through 8 go through the 150 frauds in order. And then there is a book series that has different pieces of what I talked about tonight, but most of this tonight came from the Human Evolution books, volume 3 and 4, which have, about 1,000 pictures in each book. It's very easy to read and very easy to understand. It's not wordy and not complicated, but it's very accurate. And there are also teacher's manuals that make this a 4-semester curriculum for any student age 7th grade up to adult, but like typically it'd be 7th grade through 12th grade. And you can add this to any curriculum that you already have for math class, English class, but this would be the most important class your kids, your nephews, your grandchildren will ever take, because if they don't have this, they're going to be convinced when they get to college that evolution is true, because they won't have the goods, what I just showed you. They won't have this goods and other talks that I've given. And so they become convinced that evolution is true. Well, then they become convinced that the Bible is not true. It's a bunch of stories. And then they'll be convinced that there is no God. And then they will be signing off from your family. And that was my story. Unfortunately, by God's grace, I found my way back.